How can myth play a role in conflict? Long ago, people met each other in the woods, on the plains, in the oceans, and there was always the potential for conflict. How does one story color the perception of the other or the other's humanity? Are myths exclusionary, inclusionary, or both? What is the role of the truth or falsehood of the myth behind our judgments of others? Let's discuss that. Whenever one meets someone new, a discovery of the other creates an opportunity and is a crucial time. Sometimes those meetings resulted in war and genocide. One's worldview, as expressed through stories, demonstrate the discourse and dominance of perception of the world at the time. So we need to understand the mythic stories of both groups to understand how they might act. Some lack of understanding occurs at not just the linguistic or cultural levels, but at the narrative level as well. Let's take Meso-America as an example of this, as related and described in Tzvetan Todorov in his book, The Conquest of America. Myth suggests. When you believe a story or narrative, you find things that aren't necessarily borne out in fact. Because Columbus thought he would find Indochina, he saw signs of it everywhere. So the dominant narrative would lead to misunderstandings on the level of where you are and who you are dealing with. God's control of nature and the sailors being subject to that nature made him subordinate to both nature and the sea, and therefore subject also to God, who controls all of these elements. Rain, the stars, and the wind were all controlled by the God that supported and was on Columbus' side. Thus, all the signs of God's favor are perceivable, and Columbus' own interpretation of all the things around him, everything new, all of it fit his understanding and conditioned his way of seeing. Any European leader of Columbus's time avails themselves of this same belief system. If you are in power, your power comes from a greater power. So you must be appointed by that greater power. The way you see the world is based on the interpretation of all the signs around you and reflect your worldview. So Columbus' perception of the natives was conditioned on where he thought he was. So he begins by believing them to be from the Indias, but they're naked. He thinks they are noble savages until they refuse to do what he asks of them. Because the mythology from which the natives are working is not from Spain, these natives are unintelligible. They don't have any writing system, so they are by nature flexible and unrelatable, untranscribable, and untransmissible. So when perceiving humanity, one starts from one's own experience and knowledge. I either extend rights as an equal to the other, or I dehumanize the other for my own purposes. But since my God is the only God, I will prevail. It is written. Also, my superiority is reinforced by my technologies. Economic domination was a given. But what was the economy? So Columbus develops two mythic understandings of the natives. The first is that they are noble savages, welcoming, hospitable, giving, until they don't anymore. Then they become dirty dogs, not human, subject to submission or death. They first see them as equals, then, in failing to subdue them properly, they must dehumanize them to justify murdering them, which they do. So the dominant narrative or worldview, the mythic structure of Christianity with the one true God, reinforces Columbus' perceptions. There was no philosophical or theological language or understanding at that time which classified religion as myth or the story as mythological. But we can see it now. Columbus' reasoning is thus: if the savages would not Christianize and subject themselves to the God on earth, God's own representative, the king and the church, and here the king had sent Columbus as his proxy, then they would choose to be savages if they wanted to be, and therefore subject to enslavement and death. Yet it was also the Aztecs' others myth that kept them from fighting back, from defending themselves. For the mythic dialogue at work here was two-sided, with one dominant active conqueror and a more passive leader at a loss for words. But why? We need to look at the stories of the Aztecs to understand this, which is another presentation, the next one. For Todorov, when it comes to any text or myth, lying or deception is not relevant. For if the person believes they are speaking the truth and the hearers believe it, then it is receivable and believed. That which is believed conditions perception, and behaviors are predictable as a result. Falseness is irrelevant. People act according to what they believe. Believing makes it true. We have an example of this more recently in the events of January 6th, 2021, to help us understand this principle to be true. Whether something is true or not is irrelevant to the actions that result from the belief. I will continue this theme in the next presentation in talking about mythic conflict.